articulate. You all know, of course, the story of and the fact that education was withheld from black people over the 2.5 centuries that slavery existed. But that continued afterwards. It was only through the dogged pursuit of excellence by black institution builders and with religious and liberal allies that black people were able to build an infrastructure of education in the South and elsewhere that would make possible people like Martin Luther King. We have to remember that the importance of knowing your foundation, the importance of knowing what's happened before you, for all the glories and triumphs, but perhaps most importantly, the failures and setbacks. See, this doesn't fit well in a country that measures its success and its progress by profit. It's only through the political process that we see the intrusion of rhetorics of the past. But often those are rooted to notions of liberty that is really about a marketplace and not about our shared humanity. King, as you know, was accused of being a communist, of being in conversation with a man named Stanley Lieberson, who was a communist, who did advise King. But the other part of King's story is that King was searching for alternative systems of living, alternative standards by which to measure success and to organize society. So he came into an understanding and a relationship of socialism on his own, part of the education process. When we think about the privileges of exploring ideas, of studying the past, we only want to distill it in terms that are readily packaged as success stories. But the King that you sit here and celebrate today was a man who took the time to study the great thinkers, to listen to how they came into a fullness of their own understanding. We hear about Gandhi because Gandhi makes sense to us because of his nonviolence. And in a country where revolution is always seen as an inherent threat to democracy, never minding the fact that no other country in the world had a civil war as significant and as bloody to end slavery as the United States of America. So let's be clear, we've had 2 revolutions. The first one violent to overthrow the yoke of the English, and the second one violent to end slavery. Revolution is part of the traditions of Western democracy and Western civilization. So as King played with the rhetoric of change, as King adopted the strategy of nonviolence, King was fully aware of what the alternatives were because he had studied them. See, back to those young people today, those 2 generations growing up in a post-civil rights era, all those lessons are being lost. Those kids are political fodder for the latest census report about how many of them are failing in school, the latest Bureau of Justice statistics about how many of them are headed to prison, the latest poverty studies about how many of them have fallen behind in the 21st century. But they're more than just data points on a statistical table. They're more than just a calculated cost-benefit analysis about the latest educational solution. They're human beings. And unfortunately, the tragedy in our moment is that they're not being taught to demand their humanity. They're not being taught to craft narratives and stories of who they are. And I'm not talking about carrying it back to pre-colonial African civilizations. That's important too. I'm talking about some of the basics that are readily accessible because the people who lived those lives and fought those fights are still with us today. Let me give you an example. In September of this past year, 2011, the Southern Poverty Law Center produced a study called Teaching the Movement. The idea behind the study was to give evidence, or at least to explore in an empirical way, not just people's opinions and thoughts, but in an empirical way, what the status of young people's collective exposure was to the civil rights movement. What do you think the results were? Far worse than you can imagine. One finding was that of the nation's high school seniors, only 2% had basic proficiency in civil rights history. We're talking about identifying basic leaders, significant moments from Brown to the bus boycott, to the March on Washington, the March over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, so on and so forth. There was more complexity in the standards as well. Tactics, strategies. What had come before? What were they building on? 2% of the nation's high school seniors passed the test. That is an indictment of all of us. Because the very focus in a post-civil rights era on those lessons has been, as Mr. Lewis described in his own way, under attack. Seen as divisive, anti-American, a form of reverse racism. Why talk about all those terrible times before, when collectively, in the spirit of King, right? This is the same King that's now part of Hallmark commercials, reduced to a soundbite, reduced to a symbol of America's greatest aspirations. But what about reality? What about the fact that our kids are experiencing poverty at rates we haven't seen in 50 years? What about the reality that our kids are facing the likelihood of incarceration on a scale never experienced, as Mr. Lewis said, in human history? How many of you are right now prepared to come to terms with that reality? Not because you ought to be taking kids to visit jail cells. In my opinion, that's missing the point. That's reinforcing a set of expectations. You ought to be challenging the political classes in this country. You ought to be challenging the 1%. That's where the decision-making is happening in terms of expanding our capacity to fill jail cells rather than classrooms. That reality is, as one scholar many of you know has described as, the new Jim Crow. Let me tell you something straight from Dr. King's work, because I don't want you to think that this is an overlay of my own politics or an overlay of my own disgruntled mourning. It's not. It's a reflection of a lesson I think has been lost in the post-civil rights era about where King was after the Civil Rights Acts had been passed. You see, King, although he died much too young at the age of 39, King lived long enough to see that the law was insufficient to the task of making the nation live up to its promises. He lived long enough to recognize that part of the challenge of changing the reality of racial equality was taking head-on new mythologies emerging in that moment. The majority of white Americans, he wrote in Where Do We Go From Here? Chaosville Community in 1967, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act had been passed. The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia, embodying racial harmony. Now, most of what we hear from King actually, aspirationally, expresses this. But that's aspirational rhetoric. It wasn't the reality that King saw in sharecropping communities in Alabama in 1967, or in Chicago when Molotov cocktails were being thrown at black homeowners, or aspiring black renters who wanted to live in a city that had no anti-black civil rights laws on the books, but had white homeowners who were the beneficiaries of decent and fair lending standards by banks, who could live where they chose, but could also use informal practices to keep black people out. When he says they believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony, King was calling out the hypocrisy. He said, but unfortunately, in his own words, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. How do we reconcile a king just a few months away from his death describing the state of race relations in America as a self-deception, a fantasy of self-deception premised on comfortable vanity? He went on to say that the measure of change in 1967 was not that the law had been changed. He said, quote, the recording of the law in itself is treated as the reality of reform, but the work lay ahead. It also was the case that for him, the absence of people like Bull Connor or members of white citizens' councils or hooded Klansmen, what we would all consider today evidence of racist behavior, evidence of racism. I call it in the post-90s sense a time when I came in to a fullness of who I was as an adult and as a citizen of this country, the Mark Furman standard, the Mark Furman litmus test for racist behavior. If someone uses the N-word, then they are racist. Unfortunately, we live in a city where that actually happens far too often, whether it's swastikas or the N-word. But there's a more subtle fantasy of self-deception in this day and age. There's a